If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, redemption, and the untamed frontier. Your support helps us bring these forgotten legends to life. The sun hung low over Tombstone, Arizona, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. The year was 1878, and the town buzzed with the usual mixture of hope and desperation that marked every settlement on the edge of civilization. Saloon doors swung lazily in the evening breeze, their hinges creaking a familiar song that had become the soundtrack of the American West. Inside the Silver Dollar Saloon, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of cheap whiskey. Oil lamps flickered against the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. The piano player, a weathered man with missing fingers from a mining accident, pecked out a melancholy tune that seemed to capture the loneliness of the frontier. Behind the bar, Clara Martinez wiped down glasses with mechanical precision, her dark eyes scanning the room with the practiced wariness of someone who had learned to read trouble before it announced itself. At 23, she possessed a beauty that seemed almost out of place in the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory, but the hardness in her gaze spoke of experiences that had aged her beyond her years. The saloon's patrons were the usual mix of cowboys, miners, and drifters, each nursing their drinks and their secrets with equal care. Conversations were kept low, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the sharp crack of cards being slapped on tables. In a place where men carried their past like shadows and their future like dice, loud talk was often the prelude to violence. Then, the batwing doors swung open with a force that made the entire saloon fall silent. The man who entered was tall and lean, with the kind of presence that seemed to suck the air from the room. His black hat was pulled low over steel-grey eyes that had seen too much death, and his coat hung open just enough to reveal the twin Colt revolvers at his hips. Jake Morrison had a reputation that preceded him by several states. They said he was the fastest draw in the Southwest, a man who had killed 17 men in fair fights and twice that number in situations that were somewhat less than fair. His face was weathered like old leather, marked by a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a souvenir from a knife fight in El Paso. He moved through the saloon like a predator surveying his territory, his spurs jingling softly with each step. The other patrons gave him a wide berth, some pretending to study their cards with sudden intensity, others finding urgent business at the far end of the bar. Even the piano player seemed to play more quietly, as if the very music itself was afraid to draw attention. Clara felt her heart skip a beat as Morrison approached the bar. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the territory had heard about the man they called Dead-Eyed Jake, though few had ever seen him in person. He was taller than she had imagined, and younger too. Probably no more than 35, though his eyes held the weight of decades. "Whiskey," he said, his voice low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. "The good stuff, not the rotgut you serve the usual crowd." Clara nodded and reached for the bottle of Kentucky bourbon that the saloon owner kept hidden behind the bar. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured, and she cursed herself for the show of weakness. In her line of work, showing fear was like showing blood to a shark. Morrison studied her as she worked, his grey eyes taking in every detail. "You're new here," he said, though it wasn't really a question. "Haven't seen you before, and I'd remember a face like yours." "Been here 3 months, Clara replied, keeping her voice steady, "since my husband died in the mine collapse." It was a lie, of course. Clara had never been married, and she had come to Tombstone not as a widow, but as a woman running from a past she couldn't escape. But in a place where everyone wore a mask of some kind, one more lie seemed insignificant. Morrison nodded slowly, accepting the story without question. In his experience, everyone on the frontier was running from something. The smart ones didn't ask too many questions about what that something might be. "What's your name?" he asked, taking a sip of the bourbon and nodding approvingly at the quality. "Clara Martinez," she replied, then added quickly, Mrs. Martinez. A ghost of a smile played at the corners of Morrison's mouth. Well, Mrs. Martinez, I have a proposition for you. The words sent a chill down Clara's spine. She had heard propositions before, usually from men who thought her beauty could be bought like a bottle of whiskey. But something in Morrison's tone suggested this was different, somehow more serious and potentially more dangerous. I'm listening, she said carefully. Morrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I know who you are, Clara. I know you're not Mrs. Martinez, and I know your husband didn't die in any mine collapse. I know you're Clara Delacroix, and I know there's a $500 bounty on your head for the murder of Judge Harrison back in San Antonio. Clara's blood turned to ice. Her hand instinctively moved toward the small derringer she kept hidden in her skirt, but Morrison was faster. His hand closed over her wrist with surprising gentleness, but she could feel the strength in his grip. Easy there, he said softly. I'm not here to collect that bounty, not yet anyway. What do you want? Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of the piano. Morrison released her wrist and leaned back, his expression unreadable. I want to buy you. Not for the night, not for the week. I want to buy your contract from the saloon owner and take you with me. In exchange, I'll keep your secret. Judge Harrison's death stays between us. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You want to buy me? Like a horse or a piece of property? I want to give you a choice, Morrison corrected. You can stay here, serving drinks and dodging questions about your past until someone else recognizes you and decides that $500 is worth the risk of facing down a scared woman with a derringer, or you can come with me and I'll make sure you stay safe. The offer was as unexpected as it was disturbing. Clara had spent her entire adult life fighting to maintain some measure of independence, even in circumstances that offered precious little of it. The idea of being bought by a gunslinger, even one who claimed to be protecting her, went against every instinct she had. But the alternative was worse. She knew that Morrison was right about her precarious position. It was only a matter of time before someone else recognized her, someone who would be more interested in collecting the bounty than in protecting her. In a town like Tombstone, $500 was enough to buy a man's silence permanently. If I agree, she said slowly, what exactly would my duties be? Morrison's smile became more genuine. You'd be my companion. Nothing more, nothing less. I spend a lot of time traveling and the trail gets lonely. I could use someone to talk to, someone who understands what it's like to carry a past that won't let go. There was something in his voice, a note of genuine loneliness that surprised Clara. She had expected him to be crude, to make it clear that he was purchasing her for his physical pleasure. Instead, he seemed to be offering something that was almost civilized. How much? She asked. $500, Morrison replied without hesitation. Exactly what your bounty is worth. I figure that's appropriate. Clara felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. So either way, I'm worth $500, dead or alive. The difference is, Morrison said quietly, alive gives you a chance to change your worth. The negotiation with the saloon owner, a greasy man named Caleb Winters, was surprisingly straightforward. Winters was clearly intimidated by Morrison's reputation and eager to complete the transaction without complications. $500 in gold coins changed hands, and Clara found herself officially purchased like a piece of livestock. As they prepared to leave the saloon, Morrison stopped at the bar and ordered another drink. We'll leave at dawn, he told Clara. Pack light. We'll be traveling fast. Clara nodded, still trying to process the rapid change in her circumstances. Where are we going? North, Morrison replied. I have business in Colorado. There's a man there who owes me a debt, and I intend to collect. The way he said it made Clara's skin crawl. She had a pretty good idea what kind of debt Morrison was referring to, and it probably wouldn't be settled with money. That night, Clara lay awake in her small room above the saloon, staring at the ceiling and wondering what she had gotten herself into. Through the thin walls, she could hear the sounds of the saloon below: laughter, music, the occasional shout or crash of breaking glass. It was a world she had grown accustomed to, a world where the rules were simple and the dangers were predictable. Tomorrow, she would enter a different world, one where her survival depended on the whims of a man who killed for a living. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was running from a murder charge into the arms of a professional killer. But as she listened to the familiar sounds of the saloon, Clara realized that she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. It was fragile and probably foolish, but it was there nonetheless. Morrison had offered her a chance, and chances were rare commodities on the frontier. Dawn came too soon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise a new beginning. Clara packed her few possessions into a small carpet bag, leaving behind the life she had built in Tombstone. It hadn't been much of a life, but it had been hers. Morrison was waiting for her outside the saloon, holding the reins of 2 horses. One was a magnificent black stallion that seemed to match its owner's dark reputation. The other was a smaller chestnut mare with intelligent eyes and a gentle manner. "Her name's Rosie," Morrison said, nodding toward the mare. "She's got a good heart and sure feet. She'll take care of you." Clara approached the horse cautiously. She had ridden before, but it had been years, and she had never been particularly skilled at it. Rosie seemed to sense her nervousness and nuzzled her hand gently. "She likes you," Morrison observed. "That's a good sign." As they rode out of Tombstone, Clara looked back at the town that had been her home for 3 months. It was still early enough that the streets were mostly empty, but she could see smoke rising from chimneys and the first signs of activity as the town began to wake up. The trail north was dusty and challenging, winding through rocky terrain that seemed determined to test both horse and rider. Morrison set a steady pace, not pushing too hard, but making it clear that he was eager to cover ground. He rode with the easy confidence of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. For the first few hours, they rode in silence. Clara was too focused on staying on her horse to make conversation, and Morrison seemed content to let her concentrate on her riding. But as the sun climbed higher and the trail leveled out somewhat, he began to talk. "You killed Judge Harrison," he said without preamble. "I'm curious about why." Clara stiffened in her saddle. "I thought you said you weren't interested in collecting the bounty." "I'm not. But I am interested in knowing who I'm traveling with. A woman doesn't kill a judge without a damn good reason." For a moment, Clara considered lying again, but something in Morrison's tone suggested that he would know if she wasn't telling the truth. And after all, he was risking his own reputation by protecting her. Perhaps he deserved to know the truth. "He killed my sister," she said quietly, "not with his own hands, but with his gavel. She was accused of stealing from the family she worked for as a housekeeper. The evidence was weak, but Harrison was more interested in making an example than in finding the truth. He sentenced her to 10 years in prison." Morrison listened without interrupting, his expression unchanging. "Anna was 17, Clara continued. "She was small and pretty and completely innocent. The other prisoners, they didn't protect her. She lasted 6 months before she hanged herself in her cell with a strip of bedsheet." The words came out in a rush, as if Clara had been holding them back for so long that they had to escape all at once. "I went to see Harrison after the funeral. I begged him to investigate, to find out what had really happened. He laughed at me. Said that whores and thieves got what they deserved. So you shot him," Morrison said matter-of-factly. Clara nodded. "Right there in his study. He was sitting behind his big mahogany desk, smoking a cigar and reading a law book. I walked right up to him and put a bullet in his heart." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, processing her story. "Good," he said finally. "The world's better off without him." The simple acceptance in his voice surprised Clara. She had expected judgment, questions, maybe even disgust. Instead, Morrison seemed to understand her actions in a way that few people would. "You don't think I'm a murderer?" she asked. Morrison shrugged. "I've killed men for a lot less worthy reasons. At least you had cause." As they continued their journey, Clara began to see a different side of the infamous Gunslinger. He was certainly dangerous, and she had no doubt that the stories about his skill with a gun were true. But he was also surprisingly gentle with the horses, patient with her inexperience, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard. During their second night on the trail, as they sat around a small campfire eating beans and hardtack, Morrison began to share his own story. He had been born in Missouri, the son of a preacher who had died when Jake was 12. His mother had remarried quickly, choosing a man who turned out to be cruel and violent. "I learned to shoot because I had to," Morrison said, staring into the flames. "My stepfather had a temper and heavy hands. The first man I killed was him when I was 16, put a bullet in his chest when he came at my mother with a poker." Clara listened in silence, beginning to understand the weight that Morrison carried. Like her, he had been forced into violence by circumstances beyond his control. "After that, it seemed like every town I went to there was someone who wanted to test themselves against the kid who'd killed his stepfather. I tried to avoid it, but," he shrugged. "Men are stupid sometimes. They hear a reputation, and they think they can build their own by tearing down someone else's." "Do you regret it?" Clara asked. "The killing?" Morrison considered the question seriously. "I regret the necessity of it, but I've never killed a man who didn't deserve it, and I've never shot anyone who wasn't trying to shoot me first. That's about as close to clean as a man can get in this business." As the days passed, Clara found herself growing more comfortable with her unusual companion. Morrison was nothing like the cold-blooded killer she had expected. He was intelligent, well-read, and possessed of a moral code that, while unconventional, was surprisingly rigid. He was also, she began to realize, incredibly lonely. Despite his fearsome reputation, or perhaps because of it, he had few friends and no family. He lived a solitary existence, moving from town to town, never staying long enough to form lasting connections. "It's no kind of life," he admitted one evening as they made camp beside a small stream, "but it's the only one I know." Clara found herself wanting to comfort him, to tell him that things could be different, but she held back, unsure of her own feelings and unwilling to make promises she might not be able to keep. Their destination was a small mining town called Silver Creek, nestled in a valley between two mountain ranges. The town was newer than Tombstone, rougher around the edges, with that particular kind of desperation that marked places where men came to strike it rich and usually ended up striking out instead. Morrison's business was with a man named Thomas Brennan, a former partner who had cheated him out of a silver claim years earlier. Brennan had used the money to set himself up as a respectable businessman, but Morrison had neither forgotten nor forgiven the betrayal. "I want you to stay at the hotel," Morrison told Clara as they rode into Silver Creek. "This shouldn't take long, but it might get messy." Clara nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to lose something important. Over the past week, she had grown accustomed to Morrison's presence, to the sense of protection he provided. More than that, she had begun to care about him in a way that surprised and frightened her. The hotel was a simple two-story building with peeling paint and windows that had seen better days. Clara checked in under the name Morrison had given her, Mrs. Jake Morrison, and tried not to think about the implications of that particular alias. From her room on the second floor, she could see much of the town's main street. She watched as Morrison made his way toward a large building that bore the sign, Brennan Mining Company. His walk was different now, more purposeful, like a man preparing for war. The confrontation, when it came, was swift and decisive. Clara heard the shots from her hotel room, 3 quick reports that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. Then silence. She waited by the window, her heart pounding, until she saw Morrison emerge from the building. He was walking normally, apparently uninjured, but there was something in his posture that suggested the matter had been settled permanently. When he returned to the hotel, Clara was waiting for him in the lobby. His face was grim, his eyes harder than she had ever seen them. "It's done," he said simply. Clara wanted to ask questions, to know what had happened, but something in his expression warned her off. Instead, she simply nodded and followed him upstairs. That night, as they lay in separate beds in the small hotel room, Clara listened to Morrison's breathing and knew that he wasn't sleeping. The weight of what he had done was settling on him like a shroud, and she could feel his pain as if it were her own. "Jake," she whispered into the darkness. "Yeah? Are you all right?" There was a long silence before he answered. "I will be." But Clara could hear the doubt in his voice, the exhaustion that came from carrying too much death for too long. Without thinking, she got up from her bed and moved to sit on the edge of his. "You don't have to do this alone," she said softly. Morrison looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight that streamed through the window. "Clara, I'm not a good man. I've killed more people than I can count, and I'll probably kill more before I'm done. You shouldn't tie yourself to someone like me." Clara reached out and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble beneath her fingers. "Maybe you're not a good man by some people's standards, but you're a man who saved my life, who's shown me kindness when I didn't deserve it. That counts for something." "I bought you," Morrison said quietly, "like a piece of property. What kind of man does that?" "A man who was trying to save someone he cared about," Clara replied, "even if he didn't know it at the time." Morrison sat up, his face close to hers. "Clara, I didn't expect to feel this way about you. I thought I was just helping someone who needed help. But somewhere along the trail, it became more than that." Clara felt her heart skip a beat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that for the first time in my life, I have something worth protecting, something worth living for instead of just surviving." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, as if both of them were afraid of breaking something fragile, but it was also full of promise, of the possibility that two damaged people might find healing in each other. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against his. "What happens now?" "Now we figure out how to build a life together," Morrison said. "I'm tired of running, tired of killing. Maybe it's time to find somewhere to settle down." "Can you do that?" Clara asked. "Can you just walk away from what you've been?" Morrison was quiet for a moment. "I don't know, but I want to try. For you, for us." The next morning, they left Silver Creek together, but this time as partners rather than as owner and owned. Morrison had decided to head further north, to a territory where his reputation might not follow him, where they could start fresh. They traveled for weeks, through mountain passes and across vast plains, always moving toward a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. Along the way, they talked about their dreams, their fears, and their hopes for a life that might be something more than survival. Clara discovered that Morrison had a talent for storytelling, a gift for seeing the humor in their often difficult circumstances. He, in turn, was amazed by her resilience, her ability to find beauty in the harsh landscape they traveled through. In a small town called Hope's End, they found what they were looking for. It was a farming community in a fertile valley, far from the mining camps and cattle towns, where Morrison's reputation might precede him. The people there were hard-working and minded their own business, which suited them perfectly. Morrison used the last of his money to buy a small ranch on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, just a modest house and enough land to run a few cattle, but it was theirs. For the first time in either of their lives, they had a home. The transition wasn't easy. Morrison struggled with the peaceful routine of ranch life, sometimes seeming restless and on edge. Clara had to learn to trust that their happiness wasn't temporary, that it wouldn't be snatched away by the past that seemed to follow them like a shadow. But gradually they began to settle into their new life. Morrison proved to be a skilled rancher, and Clara discovered that she had a gift for managing the household finances. They worked together, building something that neither of them had ever believed possible. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, Morrison took Clara's hand in his. "I have something to say," he said, his voice unusually formal. Clara looked at him, noticing the nervous tension in his posture. "What is it?" Morrison dropped to one knee beside her chair, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Clara Delacroix, will you marry me? Not because I bought you, not because we're running from the same past, but because I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of your love." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "Jake Morrison, you've been proving that since the day you walked into that saloon. Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding was small, held in the town's modest church, with only a few neighbors as witnesses. The preacher, a kind man named Father McKenna, didn't ask too many questions about their past. On the frontier, most people understood that everyone deserved a chance to start over. As they exchanged vows, Clara couldn't help but think about the strange journey that had brought them together. What had started as a business transaction, a desperate attempt to avoid capture, had become something beautiful and real. Morrison had removed his guns for the ceremony, hanging them on a peg in their bedroom, where they remained except for the practical necessities of ranch life. He was determined to leave his violent past behind, to become the kind of man who deserved the love of a woman like Clara. Life on the ranch was challenging but rewarding. They faced droughts and harsh winters, sick cattle and broken equipment. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. In the evenings they would sit by the fire and talk about their future. Morrison spoke of expanding the ranch, maybe starting a family. Clara dreamed of opening a small school for the children in the area, using the education she had received before her life had taken such a dark turn. But the past has a way of catching up with people, no matter how far they run or how much they change. It came for them on a cold morning in early spring in the form of a U.S. Marshal and a wanted poster with Clara's face on it. Marshal William Tucker was a methodical man who had been tracking Clara for over a year. He had followed her trail from San Antonio to Tombstone, from Tombstone to Silver Creek, and from Silver Creek to Hope's End. He was good at his job, and he believed in the law above all else. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, tipping his hat as Clara answered the door, "I'm here to arrest you for the murder of Judge Harrison." Clara felt her world crashing down around her. She had known this day might come, but she had allowed herself to hope that it never would. Behind the marshal, she could see Morrison working with the cattle in the distance, unaware of the danger approaching. "I suppose you want me to come quietly," Clara said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "I'd prefer it," Tucker replied. "But one way or another, you're coming with me. Can I say goodbye to my husband?" Tucker considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Call him over, but no sudden moves, and no weapons." Clara stepped onto the porch and called Morrison's name. When he looked up, she waved him over, trying to keep her expression neutral, but Morrison knew her well enough to sense that something was wrong. He approached slowly, his eyes taking in the marshal's presence and the tension in Clara's posture. His hands moved instinctively toward his hips, but he had left his guns in the house. "What's this about?" Morrison asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Your wife is wanted for murder," Tucker explained. "I'm here to take her back to San Antonio to stand trial." Morrison's face hardened. "The hell you are!" "Sir, I don't want any trouble. But I have a job to do, and I'm going to do it." "Jake, don't," Clara said quickly. "It's all right. I knew this day would come." But Morrison was already moving, his body falling into the stance of a man preparing for violence. Despite his efforts to leave his past behind, the reflexes were still there, honed by years of survival. "She's not going anywhere," he said quietly. Tucker's hand moved to his gun. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but interfering with a federal marshal is a serious crime." "My name is Jake Morrison," Morrison said, and Clara saw the marshal's eyes widen in recognition. "And that woman is my wife. If you want to take her, you'll have to go through me." "Morrison," Tucker breathed. "Dead-eyed Jake Morrison. I should have known." "You should have," Morrison agreed. "Now I suggest you get back on your horse and ride away. Pretend you never found us." Tucker was clearly torn. He was a brave man, but he wasn't stupid. Morrison's reputation was well earned, and the marshal had no desire to test it. But he also had a job to do, and he took that responsibility seriously. "I can't do that," he said finally. "I took an oath." Morrison nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Clara, go in the house." "Jake, no," Clara pleaded. "There's been enough killing. I'll go with him." "No," Morrison said firmly. "We've built a life here. We've found happiness. I won't let anyone take that away." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Two men, each committed to their respective paths, facing each other across a small yard that had become a battleground. In the end, it was Tucker who made the first move. His hand went to his gun, but Morrison was faster. He had always been faster. The shot echoed across the valley, startling birds from the trees and sending the cattle running. Tucker fell to his knees, his own gun only halfway out of its holster, then toppled forward into the dirt. Morrison stood over the marshal's body, his smoking gun still in his hand. For a moment, he looked like the old Jake Morrison, the man who had killed 17 men in fair fights. But then Clara saw his shoulders slump, and she knew that this killing hurt him more than any of the others. "I'm sorry," he said, though Clara wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to the dead marshal. "I'm sorry." Clara moved to his side, taking the gun from his hand and wrapping her arms around him. "I know," she whispered. "I know." They buried Tucker in the hills above their ranch, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. Morrison spoke a few words over the grave, acknowledging the marshal's courage and dedication, even as he mourned the necessity of his death. "We can't stay here," Morrison said as they walked back to the house. "When he doesn't report back, they'll send others. They'll never stop looking." Clara nodded, though her heart was breaking. They had been so close to the life they had dreamed of, so close to real happiness. Now they would have to run again, to start over in some other place, where the past might not find them. "Where will we go?" she asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "North," he said finally. "Canada, maybe. Or Alaska. Somewhere far enough away that our names don't mean anything." They spent the next few days preparing for their departure. Morrison sold the cattle to a neighboring rancher, and Clara packed their belongings into 2 small bags. They were leaving behind everything they had built, but they were taking the most important thing, each other. On their last night in the house, they made love with a desperation that spoke of all they were losing and all they hoped to find. When morning came, they saddled their horses and rode away from Hope's End, leaving behind the closest thing to paradise either of them had ever known. The journey north was long and difficult. They traveled through wilderness areas where the law was thin and the danger was real, but they had each other, and that was enough. Eventually, they found refuge in a small settlement near the Canadian border. The people there were mostly refugees themselves, men and women who had come north to escape various troubles. They asked few questions and offered the kind of acceptance that comes from understanding. Morrison and Clara built a new life, quieter and more cautious than the one they had left behind. They opened a small store, selling supplies to trappers and prospectors. It wasn't the ranch they had dreamed of, but it was honest work, and it was theirs. Years passed. Clara's hair began to show silver, and lines appeared around Morrison's eyes. But their love remained strong, perhaps stronger for having been tested by adversity. One evening, as they sat by their fire listening to the wind whistle through the pines, Clara asked Morrison if he ever regretted the choices they had made. "Never," he said without hesitation. Every decision, every mile we've traveled, every hardship we've faced, it all led us to this moment. How could I regret anything that brought us together?" Clara smiled, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I love you, Jake Morrison." "And I love you, Clara Morrison," he replied. "Until the day I die and beyond." They had started as strangers, bound by necessity and fear. A gunslinger and a fugitive, two people running from their past and uncertain of their future. But in finding each other, they had discovered something that neither had believed possible: redemption through love. The frontier was a harsh and unforgiving place, but it was also a place where people could reinvent themselves, where the past could be forgiven if not forgotten. Morrison and Clara had found their second chance, and they had made the most of it. As the fire died down and they prepared for bed, Clara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. What had started as a transaction, a desperate bargain struck in a smoky saloon, had become something beautiful and lasting. They had found love in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they had held on to it despite all the forces that had tried to tear them apart. In the end, that was all that mattered. The Old West was full of stories of violence and tragedy, of dreams shattered and lives cut short. But sometimes, just sometimes, it was also a place where broken people could find healing, where love could triumph over the darkness of the past. Morrison and Clara's story was one of those rare tales, a reminder that even in the harshest of circumstances, the human heart can find a way to hope, to love, and to begin again. What do you think about love stories that begin with such unusual circumstances? Have you ever wondered if true love can really bloom from the most unexpected situations?